Dowser was a real person. She was born a slave in Richmond, Virginia. She was freed by the daughter of the family that owned her and then sent to the North to be educated. And she made the rather unusual choice of going back to the South and during the Civil War, posed as a slave in the Confederate White House so that she could spy on the President of the Confederacy on behalf of the Union.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, wow. Who wouldn't want to write a novel about this? Or a series of poems, depending on your genre. And one of the things that happens when you're writing historical fiction is we know how the history ends, but the characters don't. So there's a point, there's a long point where it's not clear what's going to happen with slavery and the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation isn't issued until 2 years into the war, nearly 2 years. So this is a point where she has some information. She knows it could be vital to either side, but it's before the Emancipation Proclamation and she has to decide what to do with it. It's going to start with her thinking back to her childhood, and she'll mention 2 other slaves who were also children in the same house where she was a slave. Back when I was a girl, one of the most astonishing sights in Richmond was the Fisher's stall at First Market, as odoriferous as the very depths of the James River. It was stocked by a slave as broad as an oak and seeming nearly as tall. His left hand had but a thumb and 3 fingers, the little pinky gone with not so much as a stump-like remnant left behind. How and where that lost finger went, I never knew for sure, though there were whispers his owner made the slave take the saw up in his own right hand to cut it off, punishment for some transgression. 9-fingered Nate, that's what Lily and Daisy and I set ourselves to calling him as we shrieked out stories of where his teeny pinky lay, severed and wriggling and bringing a haint's worth of harm on whatever creature it could. We'd screw our voices into kitten yowls and puppy yelps and the cries of helpless children, tormented as we imagined them to be by the diabolical wayward digit. Mama caught us at it once, and when she asked what all the fuss was, Daisy told it was 9-fingered Nate's missing 10th. Mama didn't know what or who she meant at first, till I put in something about the Fisher's stall. When Mama realized what we were saying, she got as sore as she'd ever been at any of us. That man is some mother's son, she lectured me. When she brought him into this world, he had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a name she gave him. Not a person on this earth ought to take any of that from him. Just because some slave owner did, doesn't mean any child of mine better try the same. She made me promise I'd never so much as mention the name 9-fingered Nate again, nor abide anyone else doing it. His name is Shiloh, she said, and I expect you'll not forget it. Shiloh was a name no one could forget these days, as stories seep back from the battlestead of how high the piles rose of legs and arms hacked off by military surgeons. Pit after pit, dug to bury nameless pieces of what had once been whole men, every one of them some mother's son. Each wasted limb lost over the claimed right to cut off another man's pinky, the right to call that other man property. No childhood imaginings could have suffered one Negro's pinky to be worth that multitude of pale arms and legs, all that bloody loss. No one could say what more bloody loss might come if the war continued, or what might come to Negroes especially if it didn't. If the Union General McClellan learned what I knew of Robert E. Lee's ruse, he would surely attack, capturing Richmond and toppling the Confederate government, returning things to how they were before the war. If the Confederacy fell now, slavery would still stand. But if McClellan, lacking this intelligence, fell for the ruse and retreated, Lee might well seize the great and final triumph, bringing the war to an altogether different end. If the war came to a close now, there would be no emancipation, no matter which side won. But if the war stretched on, you haven't heard a word I'm saying to you, have you? This is her husband, with whom she's supposed to be having a conversation at this time. I gestured toward the panes of our parlor window, pretending it was the latest wagon load of casualties lumbering up Broad Street that had me distracted. So much suffering and death, I said. Wilson and I watched a weeping white woman step forward to embrace a ragged, uniform-clad amputee. That's all the violence of slavery visited right back on them, he said. The way you tell it, what gunfire we hear is the very angels singing of liberation. But what if the war ends before Lincoln frees the slaves, I asked. I do believe that's the first time I ever heard you entertain the possibility you might be wrong about anything. She's been insisting that this is what the war is all about. Wilson rapped on the window frame to mark the rarity of the occasion. You know, I'm still not sure secession can do the slaves much good, but if the war is meant to bring emancipation, I suppose it's bound to last until it does. The war might indeed last if I let it, and so I pressed my lips tight and held his words dear for the next quarter hour, as I picked over what trifles I might put into the evening cipher, resolved not to give any of Robert E. Lee's plan away. And of course, you can now wonder about how the war will end.